Thank you. My name is Evan Indiana, and I had the great privilege of chairing the Jewish Community Study on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. I would like to thank State Representative Dan Frankel, County Executive Rich Fitzgerald, Chief of Staff to Mayor Bill Peduto, Dan Gilman, and any other elected officials I may have missed. I want to thank the Jewish Federation and the Jewish Community Foundation for funding this study. We want to thank the Cohen Center for their unwavering commitment to statistical accuracy. I want to thank the steering committee. We had an incredible steering committee that has spent countless hours in the process of putting the study together. And I'd like to ask them to stand. Meryl Ainsman, Josh Donner, Ray Engel, Dr. Jordan Golan, Dr. Susan Kress, Eileen Lane, Bruce Rollman, Jane Rollman, and Brian Schreiber. Thank you. I also want to take a moment to thank Randy Rubin. Randy has been tireless in the pursuit of getting the best study we can put together. And he has just been incredible. One of the Federation's key strengths is to provide solutions to complex problems. And this study is a perfect example of that. The Federation is giving service providers the tools to make better informed decisions, data-driven decisions. The real purpose of this study is to drive action. That will lead to a stronger Jewish community. That will fill gaps in service, whether they are on the Jewish engagement side or the social service side. I am excited about the future, excited to talk about the areas in which we're thriving, and excited about embracing the opportunities for growth. I also want to say I take great pride in this community. One of the very interesting things is, statistically, we had a very significant number of participants. 4% of our community, over 2,000 people participated in this study. And that's a massive accomplishment and goes to the just brute grunt work that the Cohen Center went through in getting people to participate. We have a very diverse Pittsburgh community, and it's just fabulous to have everybody here. For tonight, the program tonight is going to be first opening remarks by County Executive Rich Fitzgerald and Chief of Staff to Mayor Bill Peduto, Dan Gilman, an introduction by CEO and President of the Jewish Federation, Jeff Finkelstein, a presentation by Drs. Leonard Sachs, Janet Aronson, and Matthew Boxer. We're going to have a wrap-up by the Chair of the Board, Meryl Ainsman, and we're going to follow with a reception in the courtyard. And with that, hold on to your seats because it's going to get exciting.
It doesn't always get exciting when the county executive gets up to speak, I can tell you that. But this is an exciting opportunity to really learn about some of the demographic shifts that have happened over the past few years. And Mayor Peduto and I got a little sneak preview this afternoon with Jeff up to JCC as we unveiled this, or they unveiled it to many in the community, including some of our students from Hillel Academy. I can tell you one thing that's exciting to me. Number one, representing this community along with a city councilman named Bill Peduto for 12 years, as we shared on county council and city council the district. And as a place where I raised my family in this community, which is really the heart of where the Jewish community has been, we've been able to see the Jewish community continue to thrive. In the early 80s and 90s, when other areas were losing population, one of the things that was always strong was the Jewish population maintained a steady state of folks. But since 2002, we've seen a 17% increase, faster than any other group in the region, in the city, and where we have seen success. The other thing that's very, very exciting, and they'll talk about this a little bit later, is that 40% of the children in the Jewish community are under the age of 5 years old. What does that mean? That means there's a lot of young parents who have moved into the community, are having families, and helping grow the community in a positive way. We also realize that over 84% of the adults in the Jewish community have college degrees or above, which is really reflective of what the demographics in Pittsburgh has become. It has become a technological wonder, in many ways, a model for what's going on in the country right now, which is why Amazon and those other communities and those other companies want to be here. But I think, as you'll see from the study, as the community continues to spread out, 20% of the Jewish households are in the South Hills, almost 10% are in the North Hills. Still, again, a solid group in the city and in Scroville in the East End, but it is growing in other parts of the county, which is very, very important and very, very positive for this region. But not everybody, like other parts of the city, are sharing in what's going on. There is economic insecurity, there's health issues, there's other issues that need to be dealt with, and I think the study really talks about that in a very positive way. But again, this is something I think a lot of folks in the community should be proud of. One of the things that I had seen, and as I look around the room, I see a lot of my neighbors, a lot of folks. It's not just people that care about the Jewish community and just the Scroville neighborhood, but really contribute to the vitality and vibrancy of what's going on in this whole region. And we're so lucky that exists in the community. So for the Federation, I want to thank them for what they've done. The Cohen Group who did the study, and we're going to hear about a little bit later. And the collaboration that we work with within the government. We're going to hear from State Representative Frankel at the state level, obviously at the county level, my office, and Mayor Perduto. You're going to hear from his Chief of Staff, Dan Gilman, in a minute. So anyway, congratulations to everybody. I think there's a lot of exciting news and a lot of things to build upon, but also some challenges that need to be worked on. And it's one of the great things we do in this region is we work on challenges, we work together, we work pragmatically, and we get things done. I think that's something that's very reflective of some of the folks that are in this room. It's now my honor and I guess obligation to introduce the Chief of Staff to the Mayor, Dan Gilman, who also represented this area for the last 4 years and did a fantastic job following in the footsteps of his former boss, not boss and now boss again, that he's had. And I was told that I have to say nice things about him. I wasn't going to. The fact that his mother is here, I would make me sure that I will say nice things about Dan Gilman. But no, I really appreciate the work that Councilman and now Chief of Staff Dan Gilman does. We're talking to each other every day. Him and my Chief of Staff, Jennifer Liptak, are always working on the problems and making their respective bosses look good. So without further ado, Chief of Staff to Mayor Perduto.
One of the things Mayor Perduto always said after he became mayor was that the best about being mayor is you get a front row pass to everything in the city, and you get to be a part of communities you're not otherwise a part of. And he often said that being a councilman, he was made to feel such part of the Jewish community. And so I like to say that Rich makes me feel part of the Irish community, Bill the Italian community, and both have become a part of our community with combined, close to a half century of service in the East End between the two of them. I also have to say, and then I'll be serious, standing up and speaking from the bema like this makes me feel like everyone's about to throw candy at me, but I'm much more serious to come. The mayor and the county exec spoke this morning at the first launch today, and the mayor and I were talking about how the study, in a sense, is actually not surprising at all. Though there is certainly a lot of granular information that's important to the Federation and to other Jewish organizations, it pretty much matches the trends we see in Pittsburgh. In the city of Pittsburgh, the average age of a city resident is 32.8. It is one of the youngest cities in America, coming from a time in 1995 when I moved here when it was the second oldest county, only second to, I think it was West Palm. So that is amazing. We have the second fastest growing population of millennials with a college degree in the entire United States behind Boston, and the third fastest growing population with a master's degree behind Boston and Washington, D.C. So when you hear news today like Amazon adding 125 employees or several other announcements, you're likely to hear in the next couple of weeks of companies moving here, companies growing here. It's not a surprise because we have this young talent. We have a millennial workforce that is exactly what these companies are looking for. And what's important is that we all shift our priorities because of it. And that means us in city government, and it means the Jewish community. And I think the greatest challenge is to those of you in the room who are executives, whether certainly to Jeff, but to other executives, to rabbis in the room, because what's most difficult about this is you're not serving the majority. And for those of us that have to get elected or get our bosses elected, it's really easy to serve the majority and to serve those who vote. And I will say something that people will laugh, but I'm dead serious. And the best example I can give is bike lanes. Bike lanes, we know, are not the most popular thing in Pittsburgh, but I can tell you it was in the top couple of things Amazon listed that they were looking for. The number one thing that young people graduating college consider with what city they move to is whether or not they have to own a car. So it's time to change the mindset. And it doesn't mean funding necessarily the issues, the organizations, the priorities that are what your board always had, or is it what the majority had, or what the people who vote for you have, but it's about investing in the future. I've talked to, I don't know if Brian's here, but I've talked to different people at the JCC, and not to put someone on the spot, but as the father of a young one, and any minute now, any day now, a second one, my phone hasn't rung yet, but any moment now, a second one, just go out to the JCC pool on any Saturday and look how overcrowded the infant pool is. It's absolutely amazing. You can't get an inch of space in that pool if you show up after 10 o'clock because 40% of our children are under 5. What are we going to do in terms of JCC activities that make that type of a shift? What are we going to do in our funding priorities that focus now on what kids under 13 do on a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday? How we tie it into the athletic leagues we have, how we tie it into our after-school programming, how we mix our religious education with our holiday traditions, with the social aspect of Judaism. And we've done some amazing things. I would say one of the best things I have is a young father's PJ library, which is an absolutely masterful work by the Jewish community and investing in the next generation. We're actually hopefully soon going to steal it and mimic it citywide for all city children with a similar program. Because you build a library for every child, and you take it on as a community, that it truly is a village that raises a child. And then there's the things we need to do together that are important regardless of what your religion or if you have no religion at all. And that is, how do we make the city more walkable? How do we invest in our playgrounds? How do we invest in our baseball fields? How do we do it in an equitable way? But because, of course, we know as Jews that it's not just about ourselves, but it's about taking part in the larger community. How do we make sure that every child in Homewood lives 5 minutes from a walk from a park the same way children in Squirrel Hill do? Those are the challenges we all face, and it's something we're going to do together, the state, the county, the city, and the Jewish community together. So this report, I can't say I've read every page, but I have flipped through the entire report, and it's fascinating information, but not wholly shocking. And that's a great opportunity for us to learn and work together. So thanks for including us tonight. We look forward to working together.
So I'm Jeff Finkelstein. I am the CEO of the greatest federation in the greatest Jewish community. I will join Evan, who made all of those thank yous without repeating them all, but I join him in thanking all the people that he recognized. But I also want to thank Evan for his chairmanship of this effort. This has been 16 years in the making since the last study took place in the Jewish community. And I wanted a brief chance to speak about 2 things tonight. First, I want to make sure that everybody knows that the Jewish Community Foundation of the Federation funded 100% of this study. And the Federation will be making staff time available to organizations and synagogues to dig deeper into the data after tonight. This is some of what Federation does best. Those things that serve the entirety of the Jewish community. So to everyone who's a donor here, know that you help make this possible. My second point is around the content of the study. And actually, Dan and Rich both made a lot of the points that I wanted to. Without revealing any of the details, there are data points contained in the study that are going to show that some of the things we're doing already seem to be having a positive impact. We have to find ways to do more of them. We have to build on successes. On the other hand, there are areas that will become apparent where we're losing ground as a community. We need to be able to take a hard look at what we're currently doing and determine what changes we must make. One of the oft-quoted texts of Pirkei Avot is of Hillel, who says, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, who am I? If not now, when? We each need to be thinking not just about ourselves, not just about what we like that our community already offers, but of everyone in the growing Pittsburgh Jewish community and what their needs are. We cannot be only for ourselves. We cannot be defensive. It's too easy to start throwing out objections to why the data isn't right in order to validate things that we are already doing. Or look at the data and say to yourselves that this doesn't apply to my organization. Don't get caught in this type of thinking. We must embrace change because those who make up the Pittsburgh Jewish community of 2018 may need or require different products and programs than the community of 2002. Let's be open in our thinking. As a CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh, I commit that our organization will be. I hope all the organizations and synagogues represented here will as well. Because if not now, when? Thank you.
So good evening, Erev Tov. I'm Len Sachs from Brandeis University, Jones Center, and it's really my privilege to be with you. A terrific turnout. Dan Gilman said many of the things that will, I hope, become evident from the data. My job right now is to give a little context to the study, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to run through the details. I wanted to start in giving context by talking about this problem of counting Jews. We're a difficult people. We're difficult people to count. There are many things in the Jewish world and in Jewish thought. We are of two minds. So there's one mind, and in a couple of weeks we're going to read Parashat Midbar, and we're going to read about an assiduous counting of Bnei Yisrael in the desert. I joke sometimes with some of my dissertation students that I don't require as much methodological detail as Tanakh does about how to go about a count. And the interesting thing for me is that at the very same moment that we read this parasha and we talk about counting Jews, that we read a Haftorah that says, "And the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which shall neither be measured nor counted." And so at the same time as we are describing how we counted ourselves to understand our strength, understand our ability to respond to enemies, our strength in the desert of Midbar, at the very same time, our tradition says, wait a minute, each Jew is so precious, we don't want to count them because we don't want to miss somebody. We don't want to miss the precious numbers of individuals who are Jews. And I put this out there because we didn't actually count people. We did a survey, we did a sample survey. We interviewed, and I'll talk about it in a minute, a relatively small group, 2,111 individuals. And from this, we are estimating both the size of the population and the characteristics of the population. I want you to keep in mind as we talk about specific numbers tonight. You don't have to go take an extra Tylenol or otherwise medicate yourself because there are so many numbers on the screen. What you should be thinking about are the patterns that are evident from these numbers, how they relate to one another, and how they fit together in a narrative. When we start going through the numbers, if there are questions, and we call them questions of clarification, we're happy to address them because we don't want somebody sitting there saying, I don't understand this, and then they can't listen to anything else. And we will leave time at the end for discussion and then hopefully open it up to a conversation with with all of you about what to do with the numbers. One final thought from a Jewish thinker, Albert Einstein. And again, important context for understanding this. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. I use this to remind ourselves that we are taking the measure of the community, we are estimating the characteristics of the community, but I don't have quite enough putzpedic to suggest that we have described Pittsburgh Jewry. We've described the characteristics. You, all of us know, all of us in the room will know more than are actually represented here. So what did we do? Oh. Where's it? There we go. We did a complex survey. It involved multiple samples, some people randomly selected, some people who were just invited to participate in this survey. We think we've used state-of-the-art techniques. They're not perfect, but we've used the best methods available to make our estimates. I want to, in particular, give a shout out to those, we call them on the first line, the completed eligible households. These are the 2,111 individuals who agreed to be interviewed, or in some cases responded online to a survey. I presume there are a few of you in this room who got into the sample. This wouldn't have been possible without you. We close my piece of this by saying that one of the reasons that I feel so privileged to be on the BMA tonight and to be here is that I got my college and graduate school education down the street at the University of Pittsburgh. I spent many, many years working in Langley Hall, and was a psychology student and had become a social psychologist. For me to return to Pittsburgh in a very different role and to try to be helping the community understand where you are and where you're going is really quite an honor. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Matt Boxer, and he's going to take us through first the basic demographic data and some of the interstate findings. Thank you.
So the first question that people ask anytime we do one of these studies is, how many Jews are there in our community? There you go. There are 49,200 estimated Jews in the greater Pittsburgh area. It's growth of about 17% since your last study in 2002. And the Jewish community represents about 2% of the area population. By area, I should emphasize this refers to let me see if I got this right. Allegheny, Beaver, Butler, Washington, and Westmoreland counties. As you can see, the number of Jewish children has shrunk a bit for reasons that we go into in great detail in the report. But the total number of people in Jewish households has increased to almost 60,000. So one good way to think about this is you are a Jewish community of nearly 60,000 people, of whom nearly 50,000 are Jews. This incidentally makes Pittsburgh roughly the 32nd largest Jewish community based on Federation catchment areas in the United States. Those of you who have been reading the press reports from the community studies that were released last week in DC and San Francisco probably know this is something that a lot of federations like to brag about, where they rank. So you're 32nd. Larger than most, but smaller than a few. And I don't know how clearly you can see the map on the right side of the screen here. but the map is something called a dot density map. It shows the rough distribution of the population within the area. And we've highlighted specific geographic areas as well. The green on top is what we've classified as the North Hills. Squirrel Hill, you can barely see, but it's the darkish blue sort of in the center on the right. It's obscured by these pink dots. Each dot represents 50 households. The dots are not in the exact location. They're randomly located within the zip code where those households live. But there are so many Jewish households living in Squirrel Hill, you just can't really see it very well on the map. The light blue is what we classified as South Hills. The light green is west of Pittsburgh. It does exceed the borders of the city of Pittsburgh by a little bit, but anywhere it does, it's because there's a zip code that is at least partly within the city of Pittsburgh. And the rest of the area is, of course, the surrounding area in the 5 counties in the study. So one of the big highlights from this morning, 26% of all Jewish households in the area reside in Squirrel Hill. It remains the center, both geographically and institutionally, but also personally, of the Jewish community. Another 31% of Jewish households in the community are in the rest of the city of Pittsburgh, and most of them, if you can see the dots on the map, are either adjacent to Squirrel Hill or within a couple of zip codes. The Jewish population in the city is very heavily concentrated in the East End. You do have significant suburbs in the South Hills and the North Hills, and 14% of Jewish households are spread around the rest of the 5-county region. This is some of the demographic breakdown of the population. People are always interested in what is the denominational breakdown of Jewish adults in the community and how does it compare to where we were the last time we conducted our study. As with most Jewish communities in the United States, the proportion of conservative Jews is declining. The proportion of Reform Jews is also declining a little bit. The Orthodox population has grown a little. And really the big change from 15 years ago is you have a much larger proportion who say that they're secular or just Jewish or culturally Jewish, or they don't adhere to any particular denomination whatsoever. Overall, denominationally, Pittsburgh Jewry looks a lot like the U.S. population as a whole, the U.S. Jewish population. The community is both somewhat younger and somewhat older than the U.S. population as a whole. Clearly, if you look at the table on the right, you do have a larger proportion of senior citizens. And if you look at the top of the table, you have fewer who are 18 to 34, but the vast majority of those folks are under the age of 30. It seems that sometime around the recession of 10 years ago, you had a significant number of people who would be in their 30s today who left the region and sought better economic opportunities elsewhere. So you have fewer people in their 30s. Most of your growth right now is being driven by newcomers, people coming here for college or for their first jobs who are in their teens or 20s. And the hope is that a significant number of them will stay and start their families here. 61% of all households in the Jewish community in Pittsburgh include at least one married couple. That's a little bit down from 2002. 18% of households include minor children ages 0 to 17. That's down from 30% in 2002. And your intermarriage rate of couples is 44%. Which is a little bit lower than the national average, but might increase as some of these young adults who are currently unmarried get married. So how are the Jewish children being raised, and how does it look between in-married and intermarried families? Well, in in-married families, almost all of the children are being raised Jewish in some way, most of them by religion, but about 1 in 7 are being raised culturally Jewish. and a very small proportion, 1%, are currently being raised in no religion at all. In intermarried families, the picture is significantly different. 33%, 1 in 3 children of intermarried families in this community are being raised exclusively Jewish, whether by religion or culturally. Another 11%, which is the light purple sliver you see here on the right, are being raised Jewish and another religion, usually Christianity. Only 6% are being raised exclusively in another religion. And here, I think, is where the opportunity is for the community. About half of the children of interfaith families are being raised in no religion at all, or the family hasn't decided yet how to raise the kids. This is a little bit below the national average, the proportion being raised Jewish. Typically, these days, we see something around 60% of the children of interfaith families are being raised Jewish in some way. And the key is to get them involved in high-quality Jewish educational programs of some sort. Whether it's a school, a camp, a youth group, you want to give these children an opportunity to explore their Jewish heritage and see where it takes them. There's definite opportunity for growth here. A significant number of these, roughly half of all children of interfaith parents in this community who are not being raised Jewish, might come to identify as Jews at some point in the future. Synagogues. Synagogues have, of course, traditionally been the center of Jewish religious life in American Jewish communities, and Pittsburgh has been no exception. At the time of your last study, over half of all households identified as members of a synagogue. Today, the number is closer to 1/3. And of those, the model has changed somewhat. It used to be belonging to a synagogue meant that you joined a congregation like this one, with a firmly established building where you paid your dues, you showed up, or more often you didn't show up, maybe on the high holidays, and you sent your kids to Hebrew school. Today, belonging to a congregation often means something slightly different. You don't have to belong to a congregation that has its own building. And in fact, only 19% of all households in the community say they belong to what we refer to as a brick and mortar synagogue where they pay dues. The other 16%, they belong to some sort of alternative model. They perhaps belong to a brick and mortar synagogue, but they don't pay dues. They consider themselves members. They might belong to an independent minyan or a chavurah. A significant number belong to a chabad. And we also have a fair number who say they belong to a congregation in some other community. A lot of these are seasonal residents who, for whatever reason, might belong to a congregation in Florida but don't belong here. Maybe they did in the past. And some of them are young adults who, when asked what synagogue they belong to, identified their parents' congregation in whatever community they came from when they came here to study. We also have a fair number who say they're members of a congregation, but they wouldn't tell us which one, so it's a little hard for us to classify exactly how, what sort of synagogue they belong to. In terms of Jewish adults, the proportion of Jews in Greater Pittsburgh who are members of synagogues or who are part of families where someone belongs to a synagogue is 38%, and that's almost exactly the same as the national rate. So a lot of people have mentioned at various points today the rate of travel to Israel is fairly high in this community. Almost 60% of Jewish adults in this community have been to Israel at least once. The comparison to the Pew National Study from 5 years ago, nationally it was found that 43% of American Jewish adults had been to Israel. It's probably closer to 50% today. You can see that there is a difference in connection to Israel, how attached people feel to Israel by how often they visit it. 33% of Jews overall in this community feel very connected to Israel. Another 30% say they feel somewhat connected. But of those who have never been to Israel, 12% say they're very much connected, and 26% say somewhat. Of those who have lived in Israel or who identify as Israeli, 81% are very much connected to Israel, not surprising that it would be high. And another 13% say they're somewhat connected. And folks who have visited multiple times but never lived there, 60% say they feel very much connected to Israel, 24% somewhat connected. The more often people visit, the more ties they develop to people in the country, the more attached they feel to the place, to the Jewish history that took place there. And so none of this is surprising. Another area where we feel there's an opportunity for the community, though, we know that you're proud of your partnership with Carmiel Misgav, but only about a quarter of Jewish adults in the community are familiar with it. And the number drops significantly once you get outside of residents of Squirrel Hill. We think there's an opportunity here both to promote your relationship with Carmiel Misgav, and by doing so, to get more people to identify with Israel, perhaps get more people to go on missions and various other trips to Israel, and build their personal relationships. I wouldn't be a Cohen Center researcher if I didn't mention Birthright Israel, which is one of our biggest research projects. 40% of people who are age eligible in this community have been on a Birthright Israel trip, which represents 9% of your total adult population. Now, the Jewish community as a whole, the stereotype is that we're all affluent, we're all well-educated, and this is certainly a well-educated community. Over 80% of Jewish adults in this community have obtained at least a bachelor's degree, and most of those have at least a master's degree as well. Usually that translates into significant economic advantages, but this community is not especially affluent. It's really solidly middle class. One caveat with these data, I should mention, when we ask the income question, this is a very sensitive matter to ask on surveys. In some ways, people are more likely to tell you about their illegal behaviors than how much money they make. We didn't ask those questions. But 27% of people who answered the question on income specifically said, I prefer not to answer what my income is. We know from looking at the standard of living question, which you see on the right side of the screen, that people who prefer not to disclose their income tended to be at the high end of things. They tended to be prosperous or living very comfortably, and very, very few people who did not want to disclose their income said that they were just getting along nearly poor. You can compare here the proportion of Jewish households in each income bracket to the proportion of all households in a 5-county area. Those numbers are taken from the American Community Study, a project of the U.S. Census Bureau. And you can see the income difference is not very great. The Jewish community has more people in the top bracket and fewer people on bottom. But across most categories, the numbers are pretty similar. And when you look at standard of living, a third of the community says that it's prosperous or living very comfortably. Almost half of the community, in addition to that, says they're living reasonably comfortably, which means that you're a solidly middle-class overall community. It's important to remember, though, these folks in the bottom 3 categories. Just getting along, and this is self-perceived, it's whatever it means to the people who answered the survey. Just getting along doesn't mean that you're homeless, it doesn't mean that you're in poverty, it doesn't even necessarily mean that you're at significant risk of poverty, but it does mean that you're vulnerable. And you have nearly a quarter of the population falling in these bottom 3 categories. So, although the stereotype is that the Jewish community is very affluent, it's very important to remember you do have people in need living in your community. And on the next slide, we're going to take a look at some of the additional information that goes along with that. And, sorry, bear with me, the clicker is being a little slow today. So as part of the survey, we asked a series of questions about whether households received certain public benefits, or if they had certain bills that they couldn't pay, or about various hardships that they might have experienced that might cause financial difficulty. And as you can see, there are substantial numbers of people receiving some of these public benefits. 6% of all Jewish households reported that they received SNAP, Medicaid, subsidized housing, or daycare assistance, none of which is necessarily an indicator of poverty, but it's certainly an indicator of vulnerability. 13% of households indicated that at least once in the last year they skipped a rent, mortgage, or utility bill payment because they couldn't afford to pay it. 13% say that if they had an emergency $400 expense, if their car broke down, for instance, they would not be able to pay it all at once with cash or on a credit card that they could pay off in full immediately. And 1 out of 4 households say that, God forbid, they lost their job today, they don't have savings to pay the bills for 3 months. This is sort of a standard question to look at economic need in communities in the United States. I don't know off the top of my head what the comparable numbers are for Americans in general. It tends to be a little bit higher, but this is still a significant level of vulnerability. Only 4% of Jewish households said that someone in the household was unable to participate in Jewish communal life due to financial constraints. They say only 4%, it's 1 out of every 25 households. But I think most Jewish communities would like that number to be 0 out of 25 households. Clearly, there are some people who are reaching out for help. We have here on the bottom of the screen a couple of quotes from people who talked about what those financial constraints were. They talk about, and these are representative of hundreds of responses we got to open-ended questions in the survey. We had people talk about, they pay their bills, they try their best, they want to participate in the Jewish community, but they don't have the money to pay for dues for the JCC or for the synagogue, or to pay for high holiday tickets, or to pay fees to participate in certain programs. They want to be more active. They just don't know where the money comes from. And even if there are programs in place to reduce fees or to reduce dues, it can be a little embarrassing. There's a certain stigma sometimes attached to going through that process. And it's not always an easy process to go through. A number of our respondents talked about that. And so we'd like to make sure that as you think about the things that you want to do to help make this community even more spectacular than it already is, don't forget about these people who have some significant financial difficulties. The next aspect of the study that we want to talk about, I'm actually going to turn over the microphone to my colleague, Dr. Janet Krasner-Aronson. Much of what you'll see in the report, because I know you're all going to sit down and read all 107 pages, there will be a test later, maybe, I'm told. We built a lot of the report around what we talk about as patterns of Jewish engagement. This is something of a new concept, but we think it's a very important one. And so much of the rest of our presentation here is going to be devoted to Janet explaining what these different patterns are and what you can use them for.
So, gets me nervous as a college professor if no one asks questions. So let me take just a couple of minutes. Are there any questions? Is the information clear? Or does anybody want to make a quick comment about what surprised them or didn't surprise them? I know I'm surprising you by asking you a question. Anything? You're good? Yes?
Explain in the first slide what your categories of Jews and non-Jews counting Jewish not.
So the question was, who counts as a Jew? Is that your translation? So terminology was developed and used in the Pew study in 2013. And And the basic categories that they used were Jewish by religion, Jewish not by religion, Jewish background. A person who was Jewish by religion was somebody who, when asked, what is your religion, said Jewish. A person who was a Jew not by religion was an individual who said, I consider myself Jewish. I have legitimate claims to being Jewish. I had a Jewish education. I converted. I have Jewish parents. Both of those groups, in Pew speak, JBRs and JNRs, are Jews. There's another category of person who had Jewish parents, but no longer, they asked, and we asked in a variety of ways, considers themselves in any way Jewish. So those are non-Jewish. And then there were also people who say my religion, they have no Jewish background, but they live in a household with a Jewish person. So that can be, in particular, a spouse who has not converted. We have if you will, this definition is a relatively liberal definition of who is Jewish, and it is, if you will, the standard definition, and it allows us to compare the results of this study with the results of other studies. Anyone else? Yes?
Earlier, in one of your earlier slides also, I think it said that 26% of the community, the Jewish community, was local, and that there was 31% from within the city of Pittsburgh, so an additional 31%. So where exactly is the end? That surprised me. Like where did you split up?
Sure. So the question was 26% of Jewish households live in Squirrel Hill, but on one of our earlier slides, we also showed that 31% of Jewish households in the 5-county area live somewhere else in the city of Pittsburgh. Where are they? And I wish the map had come out a little clearer. You would have been able to see. Most of those 31% are either in neighborhoods adjacent to Squirrel Hill or within a zip code or two of it. But the vast majority are on the east side. There are some spread out in the rest of the city, but the density is really very heavily concentrated around here.
Anyone else? Yes?
The slide on synagogue membership, I found a little confusing in terms of how many people actually belong to or consider themselves even belonging to a religion. But if they use an because there's a lot of numbers up there.
Sure. So the question was basically to explain a little bit more the synagogue slide. 35% of all households have somebody in them who belongs to a congregation of some sort, whether it's a traditional synagogue or one of these newer structures like an independent minyan or a chavurah. 19% of all households belong to a traditional brick and mortar synagogue like a Rodef Shalom. A total of 19% of the 26,800 Jewish households in Greater Pittsburgh. 19% belong to a traditional congregation to which they pay dues. The other 16% that are part of the 35, they belong to an independent minyan, a chavurah, a Chabad, a congregation that's outside the area, or in some cases they belong to a Rodef Shalom or a similar congregation, but they don't pay dues. So it's 19% are what we think of more traditionally as synagogue members. They belong to a traditional congregation, and we've been using brick and mortar so as not to confuse traditional with traditional. So 19% belong to a brick and mortar, what we typically think of as a synagogue to which they pay dues, and another 16% belong to something else. Now, those 19% who belong to brick and mortar, they might also belong to something else. So there was one table there that added up to well over 100%. There it is. Some proportion belong to multiple categories.
So thank you. So save up the rest of your questions, and we will leave plenty of time at the end for discussion. Just one addendum to the discussion of synagogues. One of the reasons that the data are a little confusing is because the situation today is a little confusing. That what does it mean to be a member? What does it mean to participate in a worship community that's undergoing change? So now let me turn it over to Janet, and she will take us through the rest of the slides.
Can I use this microphone so that's okay? Too many hands. But catch up here in a minute. All right, so as Matt indicated, I'm going to use my time with you today to introduce a concept within this study that you haven't seen before. And we've developed it as a tool to help understand the community in terms of Jewish engagement. So Jewish engagement, as we see it, is what are all the things that Jews do? What are the different behaviors that Jews engage in as an expression of their Jewish identity? We've identified a set of 15 behaviors that we've included on a list, and they range from everything to having a Seder, Passover Seder, lighting Hanukkah candles, to lighting Shabbat candles, going to services, keeping kosher, ritual behavior, to communal behavior, belonging to the JCC, donating to Jewish organizations, volunteering for Jewish organizations, and then to personal behavior, so things like reading news about Israel, or talking about Jewish topics, or just participating in Judaism in your personal life. So all of these behaviors are reported elsewhere in the study. But as you can imagine, when you see tables after table, like the one we just saw of synagogues, and you see, well, X% of households belong to synagogues, and X% like Shabbat candles, and X% volunteer for Jewish organizations, you start to wonder, well, how do these things all fit together? Is it that all of the synagogue members are volunteering for Jewish organizations? Or are there some people who are synagogue members and then don't do anything else? And then there are some people who volunteer for Jewish organizations and don't do anything else. And then there are some people who do both. So basically, we used a statistical technique to take these 15 behaviors and combine them into what we call patterns of Jewish engagement. So we use the statistics, which I will not go into, to identify groups of people. So we say, okay, here's a group of people who all do similar things. They have similar attitudes about being Jewish. Basically, Judaism means something similar to the people in this group. Then, in contrast, you have another group, and it turns out there are 5 of these groups in the community who are similar to each other, but distinct from the other groups. So, taken together, these are 5 patterns of Jewish engagement. And the purpose of this tool is, as I said, to help combine and synthesize all the other information in the report and use it as a lens to understand the community. And it will be useful in thinking about what are the characteristics of the people in each group, what are their needs, what are their interests, what do they do, how do they engage in Jewish life, so that we can think about devising programs and activities that interest each group separately. So, one of the first questions that often comes up when I talk about this is, don't we already have something that does that called denomination? Because we know, well, Orthodox Jews do certain things and conservative Jews do certain things. And doesn't that label kind of provide what we're looking for, what we've developed here? Well, perhaps at one time it did, but it doesn't do that any longer. So in this slide, I'm going to go through in detail what all of the engagement groups are, but I want to just spend a moment to point out why engagement groups are different than denominations, and in rather surprising ways. So if you look at this to understand what we're looking at here, I'm going to take a look at the second row, conservative Jews. And you might have in mind an image of what do conservative Jews. Well, it turns out that conservative Jews are divided into all of these engagement categories. Very few are in the minimally involved category, but they engage in Jewish life in all sorts of ways. Where this is really more important is in the, I think, 40% of Jewish adults who say that they have no denomination. So what does that mean? Often we think if people have no denomination, or they say they're secular or just Jewish, we tend to think that it means they don't do anything Jewish. It means that they're not part of the collective. But it turns out that although very few of the people in the none group are in the highest engagement category, the immersed, they appear in all of the other engagement groups, and particularly, keep in mind, the involved group that we'll be speaking about later. So this helps us understand that there are a lot of ways of being engaged. People fall into all different categories. Denomination doesn't really tell the whole story. Neither will, Matt will present a little bit on this later, neither do demographics. So it's not the case that all young people are the least engaged, and it's not the case that all intermarried people are the least engaged. Although there are variations, all of the demographic groups appear in all of these engagement groups. And that's why it's a powerful tool. It's not based on labels or categories, but it's based on what people actually do. So now I'm going to go through each of these groups and just give you a little taste of what their characteristics are. So the first group, which is the highest engagement group, it represents 16% of Jewish adults in the community, and we call this group immersed. Why? Because they are immersed in all aspects of Jewish life, including religious life, communal life, cultural life, and personal life. The numbers that highlighted in red, you'll see all these numbers on every slide, but the numbers in red are useful to look at because you can see how they change from group to group. So just to point out that nearly all of the people in this group are synagogue members, nearly all of them who have K through 12 age children have those children enrolled in Jewish education. About 3/4 of them have attended a Jewish program of some sort, aside from services, and all of them attended high holiday services the year before the study. So that gives you a flavor of the immersed group. The next group is called the connected group, and you can see that this is a much larger group, 29% of Jewish adults. And you can see here the numbers begin to go down, but some more than others. Here, in the immersed group, they're almost all synagogue members. Here, almost 2/3 are synagogue members. About 3/4 send their kids to Jewish education. Fewer attend Jewish programs, but still almost all of them attend high holiday services. So this is a group that is engaged almost as much as the immersed. Where you see the bigger differences that are not shown here is that they are less likely to observe Shabbat at home, they're less likely to keep kosher, and those are the main distinctions between these two groups. So those are what I would call the higher levels of engagement. Then there are two middle levels of engagement, which I'm going to describe next. And these two groups include involved and holiday Jews. And these groups both have middle levels of engagement, and what's interesting about them is that it's not that one is more engaged than the other, it's that one is differently engaged than the other. So the story becomes a little bit more complicated, especially if you can see it. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the involved group, 29% of the community. And you'll see, take a look at that synagogue member number and the high holy day number. It's dropped to, few, or not few, very few. These are people who do not participate in synagogue life, ritual life. However, they still, where they're more likely to participate, it doesn't show up here as completely, but you see over 70% of them donate to Jewish organizations. Almost half of them attend a Jewish program aside from religious services. And they have not such a high level of Jewish volunteering, but again, not shown here, a much higher level of volunteering for just general volunteering for non-Jewish organizations. So that's why we call these people, they are involved in community life. In contrast, the next group, which is called the holiday group, and it's much smaller, and you see, although the numbers are not as large as the high engagement group, much more likely to be synagogue members, 21%, 42% attend high holy day services, but almost none attend Jewish programs, almost none volunteer for Jewish organization, and only a third, far less, donate to Jewish causes. So the thing to remember here about these two groups is that this is a group, a holiday group, is a group that engages in Jewish life primarily through synagogue, high holidays, Passover, and Hanukkah. Those are the Jewish things that they do. The involved group, as I said, doesn't do those things, but they do the communal things. So again, it's not higher or lower engagement, it's just different engagement. And the last group is the minimally involved group. This is only 13% of the community. And they do little to nothing, as you can see. None of them are synagogue members, do not attend high holy day services. They still do a few other things. Interestingly, they read news about Israel very often. That's something they do on their own. You don't have to be part of an institution to do that. We mark that they have no children in Jewish education, and that's because almost none of them are raising their children Jewish. They have children, but this is the group that is a very large group that is not raising their children Jewish. So this is just an introduction to this framework of these 5 groups. And as you read the report, you'll see that for all of the information we reported based on these 5 groups, so that you can begin to see how these patterns play out. Now I want to just point out one more thing about these groups, their differences. It's not just their behaviors that differ, it's their attitudes about being Jewish, what Judaism means to them. So in some ways, the 5 groups are very different from one another, and in some ways, the 5 groups are very similar to one another. And so that gives thinking about opportunities for programming and activities that cross the different groups, that join the community together, and it gives opportunities to think about programs that are targeted to the different needs of each group. So the chart on the left asks the question, to what extent is Judaism part of your daily life? And what? Oh, thank you. Okay, the left is, to what extent is Judaism part of your very daily life? And this is the percent of people who in each group who say it's very much part of my daily life. You can see it's the vast majority of people in the immersed group, small minorities of the people in those lower engagement groups, and in the minimally involved group, almost nobody thinks Judaism is part of their daily life. So here you can see how the attitudes really correlate with the behaviors in dramatic ways. In contrast, on the graph on the right, this asks the question, to what extent is working for justice and equality an essential part of being Jewish? So again, this little long question, is working for justice and equality an essential part this is the percent of people who agree. And you can see here that on average, this is the second bar from the bottom, on average, almost 60% of Pittsburgh Jews think that this is an essential part of being Jewish. This is a little bit higher than the national average that came from you, which is the bottom bar. But you can see this is not correlated with Jewish engagement in a way that you expect. It's not that the immersed tend to agree. In fact, they are the second least likely to agree, and it's a place where the immersed and the minimally involved kind of agree that this is not an essential part of being Jewish, and the middle engagement groups very much agree with this statement. So that just again kind of illustrates some of the differences between the groups and some ways to think about them. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Matt, who's going to talk about how this fits in with the demographics of the community and how the different community groups behave according to these engagement patterns.
So, speaking of stereotypes, as I did before, there's a stereotype about young adults, people in my generation. We're apathetic, we don't care, we're disinterested, we're disengaged, and we don't do anything in the community. But if you look at things a little bit differently, if you consider that there are lots of different ways to engage in Jewish life, and you look at the breakdown of the ways people are engaging in Jewish life in this community across different age groups, you see young adults are very engaged, and they're engaged at similar levels to every other age group, with the exception of the senior citizens, who in some ways they might score a little bit lower in some categories, which has something to do with some health issues. But the youngest group, they're the least likely to show up as minimally involved, and they're the most likely to show up as immersed. These groups are fairly evenly distributed, though, across each of the different engagement categories. Geographically, you might expect that folks in Squirrel Hill would be more actively involved in Jewish life, in part because it's convenient to be involved in Jewish life here, and you'd be right about that. Similarly with the folks who live in the rest of Pittsburgh, again, most of those people are highly concentrated in neighborhoods very close to Squirrel Hill. They have pretty easy access to Jewish institutions and programs. They also tend to be more actively involved in Jewish life, and so they tend to fall into the more actively engaged engagement groups, the immersed and the connected, and less likely to be in the minimally involved category. The folks in the rest of the region, the folks who have a greater distance to go to get to Pittsburgh, you might expect them to be most common in the minimally involved group, but that is also not the case. As I've found myself saying a lot over the last day or two, in my spare time when I'm not conducting community studies, I study very small Jewish communities. My research for my doctoral dissertation helped contribute to a documentary some of you may have seen. There are Jews here that included Latrobe as one of the communities that they looked at. One of the things you find in very, very small Jewish communities is people who want any sort of Jewish life become deeply enmeshed in Jewish life because they know if they don't get involved, whatever program it is they want won't exist. The community that I grew up in Niagara Falls, you always had the same 10 people show up to services on Saturday morning because if one of them didn't show, there was no minyan and they were letting down the entire congregation. So it doesn't surprise me at all to find a relatively low proportion in the rest of the region as minimally involved. And similarly, it didn't surprise me to find a fairly large number in the rest of the region in the connected or involved categories. In some ways, if they want Jewish life, they have to work a little harder for it than you folks do who live in Squirrel Hill or in the adjacent neighborhoods. So as Janet was explaining, one one of the reasons we came up with these engagement categories is we want you to look beyond sort of the traditional silos by which people assess engagement in Jewish life. Don't just look at synagogue members and non-members. Don't just look at in-married and intermarried, young adults, senior citizens, parents of small children. You really have to look at patterns of behavior. What are people actually doing, and not what are they stereotyped to be doing? And if you do that, and if you look very carefully, I think you'll figure out some innovative ways to engage with people in the community. Now, we want to make sure that you know where to find all of the details that were revealed over the course of the research. This has really just been the tip of the iceberg, the 23 preceding slides. You'll be able to find the full 107-page report and the 180 or so pages of technical appendices, which include every question that was asked on the survey and how many people answered what answer to each question, some comparison charts that we find especially helpful to look at different segments of the community, whether it's demographic, engagement in Jewish programs, volunteering, philanthropy, synagogues, young adults. You can find a lot of the key categories broken down in ways that are easy to look up. Just a quick number, the one thing you most want to know. So all of that will be on our website. There will be a public use data set available in about a month. So for those of you who have statistical skills, you'll be able to download the data set, run your own numbers. If you're looking for a job, we're always hiring. Talk to Len. And the report, I should also say, is, I believe it's up already on the Federation's website, so it's available there as well. And we look forward to hearing what all of you think about all of the data that we've been digging into for the last year or so. If there are any questions, we're happy to take them. And actually, before we get to the questions, I forgot we did have one more slide here. We really do want to emphasize we're grateful for the opportunity to conduct this study. We're especially grateful to the members of the advisory committee who had so much important input into the design of the study, where we could not have done this without the organizations that provided their membership and mailing lists. They made it much more efficient to survey the population here. And of course, as Len mentioned at the very beginning, without the 2,111 people who completed our survey, none of this would be possible. So again, thank you very much.
If we do this, if we take them in clusters of 3, and Ramey's got the microphone, so then we want to repeat the question. Start with
Question about the index of Jewish engagement, which you developed out of this survey, out of initial findings. Is that, if I understand correctly, is that going to then, are you going to roll that out in other studies to enable comparative work in the future, or is the idea to sort of create a particular index for each community? So is it a new tool that then goes out there?
As I recall, one of the slides showed 35% of households belonged to synagogues, 19 bricks and mortar. How does that compare to 2002?
Okay.
You indicated that the Orthodox population increased from 7% to 9%. Do you have any statistics on what percentage of children the Orthodox community represents? That is to say, is that where the growth in the future is going to be?
Got it. So let me just do those 3 questions, and others can think of other questions. First, Adam, your question, the index of Jewish engagement. So we calculated specifically for Pittsburgh based on the data here. And so we now have several other communities, Boston and Washington in particular, where we've created receive based on their patterns. And it is interesting that the proportions are somewhat different, but you can compare them. It is a tool that on the one hand you want to use to describe a particular community, because that's going to be most useful to you in engaging folks in developing programs, deciding how to allocate resources. But on the other hand, yes, the comparison is so the second question, I'll turn it over to Dr. Synagogue. Again, the 37, the 35%, the 19%, and how does it compare to 2002?
So the irony of this is that Janet's actually Dr. Synagogue. I just dabbled a little. So in 2002, the study found that 53% of Jewish households in Greater Pittsburgh were members of a synagogue. It's hard to break down beyond that to compare to what we found today, in part because we asked the question in a slightly different way. In 2002, the question was, is anyone in your household a member of a synagogue, yes or no? In 2017, the question was, is anyone in your household a member of a synagogue, temple, independent minyan, chavurah, or high holiday congregation? And we had to ask the question in a different way because the synagogue landscape has changed significantly in the last 15 years. People aren't affiliating with synagogues in quite the same way as they used to. In fact, in a meeting with the scorecard committee earlier today, I talked about my congregation. I don't know what you would call it because it doesn't have a name. It's a group of friends of mine from graduate school at the University of Wisconsin. We all live within about a 5-mile radius of each other in the Boston area. And my friends hate institutional Judaism. They wouldn't be caught dead in a local synagogue. And so, if they want to have services, and they do, they want to have regular Shabbat minyanim, they want to have regular holiday minyanim. We even do high holidays on our own in one of our homes. And we have a Torah scroll for it even. Long story. We can do that, and we can meet our own spiritual needs without having to be members of one of the local congregations. Much as they might like to have us, we're not on their radar, and they're not really pushing that hard to bring us in. And if they were, they might have a shot at me, but dues are so expensive. And my friends, they're never going to join. So if they were surveyed in Boston, when we conducted that study, they would all say they're members of something. But if you asked them what is the name of that congregation, they couldn't tell you. That's one of the many ways the landscape has changed since 2002. And so it's very hard to compare to what the numbers were back then. The 53% probably is mostly comparable to what we find with brick and mortar dues-paying members of synagogues today, the 19% figure that we cited. But it's not directly comparable because a significant number of the other members of synagogues would have been among those dues-paying brick-and-mortar synagogue members in 2002 if they were asked the question then. Today, they're just doing something else. It's just very, very difficult to compare.
And let me ask Janet to answer the question about Orthodox children.
Okay, I'm going to answer that question, a short answer and a long answer. The shorter answer is we don't have that number, but we can get it, about the number of Orthodox children. But the bigger answer that I want to say, and I think it's useful to take a moment to talk about it, is that I suspect that a lot of your questions will be, does the report talk about this? The answer will be either yes, it's in the report, it's not in the report, but it's either in the report or in the appendix. It's not in the report, but we can get it. It's not in the report, but we could get it with more analysis that would be more extensive, or we can't get it, we didn't ask the question, we didn't get enough people in the category. So I suggest that if you you just have questions about what's in the report, then maybe the first thing is to do is to look at the report, and then we're happy to take those questions tonight.
Great. Other questions? Randy?
Do you believe that those that responded to the survey would tend to be involved to a greater extent in the Jewish community, more interested in Israel, so that the results of the survey would be skewed toward greater involvement, greater activity?
Great question.
Yes, could you speak to how college students were included in the survey, like 18 to 22 age range, in particular given that there are college students who maybe grew up here, have a permanent address here, but don't live here currently, and vice versa, students who don't have a permanent address here, grew up elsewhere, but are currently located within Pittsburgh?
Okay. I said I would take 3. There's a hand over here.
Are Israelis considered anywhere in your statistics?
Are Israelis considered?
Anywhere in your statistics?
Yes, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So let me deal with the methodological question. So yes, it is possible that the people who agreed to be interviewed are the more engaged, involved people. We had a relatively high response rate, close to 30%. And a little bit less than double what the Pew study got. And we have a bunch of ways of making sure that the sample is representative. It may be that people who are more highly involved, who are more willing to give answers and to stay on the phone longer periods of time. The way the survey works, however, if you're not very engaged in the Jewish community, it's a much shorter survey. If you have 10 kids and 7 of them are in day school and you're struggling financially, you're going to be on the phone a longer period of time. So that balances it out a bit. I think what we do really well is that we've figured out some techniques both to reach into the younger population, which are missed these days in many community studies, especially those that rely solely on what's called RDD, random digit dial, because virtually all young people, I used to be able to say, well, the majority of young people, now I say virtually all are cell phone, mobile phone only, and if they're like some of our children who are in their 20s and even 30s, they have telephones and telephone numbers that are still part of their parents' plan. And so you can figure out from area codes and so on where they are. So we think we've done a much better job of getting that population. But yes, this is imperfect. I said at the top that studying Jews is a really difficult problem. It's a really difficult problem because Pittsburgh is not different than the country. Jews are about 1% of the American population, so relatively tiny group. And unlike most other countries, Canada, for example, the census doesn't collect data on religion and doesn't collect it in that ethnicity in a way that we could use it. So one of the ways that most surveys make sure that you're getting unbiased samples is by comparing it to the census. So we have to use lots of other tools to do that. So I hope I, in a very Jewish way, I said yes and no to your question. But we're pretty confident. We're pretty confident that we have gotten the overall numbers correct. I think where it gets a little fuzzy and where there's lots of room for debate is the smaller and smaller groups. That's problematic. Who wants to answer this? Do you have a question?
So how do we find students? With significant difficulty. Young adults, in particular, students, are very difficult to reach for any kind of survey. But we did have a few organizations that sent us their lists. I believe JSU sent us their list, Hillel as well, I believe. Any young adults who were on any of the federation's lists, any other organization that shared their list that had young adults, we had those as well. And then, as part of our efforts to track down people who aren't on any of the lists that we got from organizations, we use something called an ethnic name string. And this is almost exactly how it sounds. There are about 150 last names that are very common in the American Jewish community. Roughly 20% of all American Jews have one of these last names. And if you had one of them and you weren't on anybody's list, we probably still found you. As long as you have an address in the Pittsburgh area, we tracked down your address, we got your phone number, and we tried calling you. So students who didn't appear on anyone's list but still have one of those names, we were able to find them. And where you might think that might bias results, and it's understandable if you do think that Helens are somehow different from Smiths who happen to be Jewish. It turns out, we did an analysis several years ago, comparing people with distinctive Jewish names to people without them across a number of community studies in Birthright Israel, a number of campus studies where we studied the undergraduate population of a number of college campuses across the country. There are no statistically significant behavioral or attitudinal differences between people with distinctive Jewish names and people without them. So even accounting for the prevalence of intermarriage and the number of young adults who have non-Jewish parents, or at least one non-Jewish parent, it doesn't bias the sample to use ethnic names to hunt people down. I'm sure we missed people who are living in dorms, institutional settings. There's just no effective way to survey them unless the university gives access, and they almost never do. It's a FERPA violation. But we did the best we could with the resources available, and I think we represented students fairly well. Oh, and Janet reminds me, we also, if they live at home with parents who live in the area, that is as well, which also reminded me, right, even if they're in college elsewhere. And that also reminds me, Birthright Israel was happy to share with us their list of parents in the area, as well as their list of applicants. And so we got a lot of students from Birthright Israel as well. Sure. We asked as one of the questions in the survey if anyone in the household is Israeli, that is, do they have Israeli citizenship? We did find some, but not very many. 3% of the population identifies as Israeli. And while we would love to be able to do good statistical analysis of that group, there just weren't enough of them. One of the hard truths of doing statistical research is whether you're talking about a population the size of the Jewish community of Pittsburgh or a population the size of the Israelis in the Jewish population of Pittsburgh, you need roughly the same amount of data to be able to do reliable estimates. And so, if we had a couple of hundred Israeli respondents, we might have been able to do something. We just didn't have enough data to go beyond how many Israelis we were able to estimate.
So thank you very, very much. This was a privilege.
So in a minute, we're going to adjourn for some refreshments outside, but I want to thank Len and Matt and Janet. They did put in an extraordinary amount of work. They dealt with a committee that was very difficult sometimes, very probing, but I think we've come up with a really great product. And as they mentioned, you can find it on their website or on the Federation website. So this, I want to stress, is just the beginning. This is just bringing out the information to the community. But there are many, many questions that will come out of this and things that we need to think about. When I say we, I mean the entire community. called the 2017 Greater Pittsburgh Jewish Community Study. So it's for everybody. It's for the synagogues, it's for the JCC, it's for our agencies, it's for people who are not affiliated anywhere, to try and evaluate what we can do and how we can change our community and continue to be a community of excellence. Some of the things I think we need to think about is the affordability of being Jewish. What are we going to do with our seniors as our population continues to age in terms of living arrangements? What does it mean to be a member? As you heard Matt go on and on about bricks and mortar and things like that. Being a member of something, whether it's a JCC or a synagogue, doesn't mean the same thing as it used to. And particularly engagement of young adults. I think there's a huge, huge opportunity here with all of the young people staying and moving back into the community. So one of the nice things about having this data is we often say, we look at what exists. Without this kind of data, we look at what exists and we try to make plans according to what we have now. Well, we can look into the future now. We can look at these 0 to 5-year-olds and say, wow, we're going to really need to educate more Jewish children. We're going to be able to plan forward rather than looking at data or looking backwards. We need to be good stewards of our community. We need to be honest brokers of community resources. And all of this will be achieved by working together and really continuing to make this a community of excellence and one that we can all be proud of. So thank you. I appreciate you coming tonight. I think this is extraordinary reading material, all 107 pages of it. If you don't have anything to do when you get home, you can read it. But there will be other follow-up with agencies, with synagogues, and with anyone else, and that we'll get that out to the community, how that will proceed. Including tomorrow, I believe we have a session with the professionals, many of the professionals that work in the community. So again, thank you for coming out. Go enjoy some sweets.